And thank you very much for coming out on what is a truly grim, grisly, freezing cold, rainy night. We've managed to have 3 events so far. Our first event was carefully timed to coincide with, I think it was England's quarter-final at the World Cup or something. And still people came out, so thanks for braving the weather. Being here, I'm Christian Broughton, I'm the editor of The Independent. And yes, would like to offer a very warm welcome indeed to this Independent Minds event. Before we start, just wanted to mention what Independent Minds is, partly because a couple of people have just asked me downstairs. Independent Minds is one of 2 subscription services we now offer. There's the Daily Edition, which gives you the iPad newspaper, for want of a better description. And if you subscribe to that, you are already a subscriber to Independent Minds because we've bundled it in. Independent Minds, however, is a standalone subscription for people. It offers additional exclusives, long reads, ebooks, events, all kinds of things as part of that package. Also, have to tell you that there is for those of you who have paid to be here and don't subscribe to The Independent, there is a special offer running today only, which gives you so you'd have paid, the discount is greater than the amount you've paid to be here. So in other words, you are getting a good deal. Let me just leave it there, shall I? But if you want to take them up on that, it's a half-price subscription. It's £55 a year, so it's only £27.50 with this discount. Tickets are £20 if you're not a member, so you can work the maths out for yourselves, I'm sure. But go and see anybody downstairs with one of the iPads behind the little stalls downstairs in the room afterwards if you're interested. The Middle East is the subject of today's discussions. They might be I see they've joined us from putting together yet another Brexit front page, but we're taking a brief break from Brexit, thank goodness. There are other interesting parts of the world. Middle East at The Independent has always been something that we've taken very seriously, our reporting there. And of course, those of you who remember the Iraq War stance that the paper took will understand why, over the past year, we've particularly enriched our reporting team in the Middle East. It means an awful lot of us to be very good on reporting that subject. But we've also added staff correspondents in places such as Moscow and Delhi recently as well. So we hope that you're enjoying that as you read The Independent. To introduce briefly the people that we have on stage, we have Belle True, who is one of the recent additions, joined us from The Times and was also working for France 24. Comes from an interesting background of print journalism, online journalism, broadcast skills, social media use. I have a short potted history of Belle here. Grew up in the UAE, so knows the region very well. Has lived in this country, in the Baltics, and has been in the Middle East for some years. In fact, there's somebody in the audience who is better qualified to speak about Belle's backstory. Well, 2 people, her father and brother over there. So better get this bit right, really. She had an interesting episode that she might talk about later, I hope, in her last assignment when she was living in Cairo, when out one day reporting, was met by the Egyptian authorities and given a pretty tough choice, either stay in Egypt and face a military trial or to leave the country immediately. And by immediately, I mean immediately. So she was after a new posting in the Middle East. She joined The Independent and she now lives in Jerusalem, although she's managed to already travel far and wide for us. From Yemen stands out for me. We've also had the water series, which has been fantastic. I hope you've all been enjoying that, those of you who are subscribers, getting the exclusive long reads on the water series. Patrick Cockburn has been with The Independent for a little longer than 6 months, as Belle has. Patrick's been with us since 1990, in fact, and was very much part of that reporting push around the... He's won many of the industry's greatest accolades, and the judges of the Foreign Affairs Journalist of the Year Award in 2014, when the year he won, described his work as follows. Patrick Cockburn spotted the emergence of ISIS much earlier than anybody else and wrote about it with a depth of understanding that was just in a league of its own. Nobody else was writing that stuff at that time, and the judges wondered whether the government should consider pensioning off the whole of MI6 and hiring Patrick Cockburn instead. The breadth of his knowledge and ability to make connections is phenomenal. something that I can vouch for, and I'm sure you all can. The American journalist Seymour Hersh put it a little bit more succinctly. Quite simply, the best Western journalist at work in the Middle East today. Olivia Alabaster is also on stage. Olivia is our international editor. She works in the London office with me. I can't tell you how valuable it is to have somebody of Olivia's experience on the desk. She joined us. Her previous job was in Beirut, where she had lived for 6 or 7 years. It was 7 years. So having that expertise built into the London team, in addition to the famous names of the Independent, established names of the Independent, and the new names, I hope you can see how it's taking our reporting there to new heights. I've always enjoyed meeting the international correspondents. Nodding over to Kim at the back of the room there. Kim Sengupta is with us as well tonight. When they come back from their trips, there are so many interesting conversations around the room. Of course, all the best bits, all the newsy stuff is in the reporting, but it's quite often the conversation in the pub or in the canteen or at the coffee shop that leaves you with some really memorable stories. And I hope that tonight you feel at ease to ask questions. I know a lot of you already have, which is fantastic. Thank you for that. I want you to feel that, we spend a lot of time thinking, how can we best tell our stories, explain the world to people? And the event series that we've got now with Independent Minds, I think, is a brilliant way to do that. So there will be some time at the end, about half an hour at the end, where we'll go through all your questions. There are people with microphones. It's being live streamed on the web and on social media. So please do wait for the microphone to come round to you before you ask your question. And as well along the way, I think there might be some opportunities to take 1 or 2 questions as we go. So please don't hold back. Please do get involved. It's your session. And I hope you get the most out of it. Thank you very much.
We've got some big themes to get to, but I wanted to start with a sort of personal question for each of you. Patrick, this might be a little unfair because there's a lot to talk about, but the years since you've been working with The Independent, obviously you started in 1990, what can you sort of describe the biggest changes you've seen in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, for journalist reporting, the changes began to come earlier, but they began to it got a lot more dangerous, I think. When I first started reporting in the Middle East, I'd been in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, so I came to the Middle East in sort of 75. And at that time, it could be quite dangerous, the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War and so forth, but most of the movements tried to accommodate journalists. I remember in Beirut, they'd give you sort of pieces of paper that would get you through their checkpoints in one piece. But from about the mid-80s, it began to get much more dangerous. People began to kidnap journalists in Beirut. Everywhere you went, it got more edgy. And since then...
Do you think that hostility has just risen since then towards journalists?
Yeah, it has. You can see that until, ISIS famously was decapitating journalists. Other governments, as Bell discovered or knew already in Egypt, but also in Turkey, more and more hostile to journalists. It's got a far more difficult job to do in that way. And other changes, it's generally more violent. It's really an era of wars. I mean, if you go, I think, from about the Afghan border, right over to Algeria, I think there are 7 or 8 wars going on, or near wars. None of these wars ever seem to end these days. We used to have wars in the Middle East, they'd come to an end. Now the ones in Somalia, Yemen, endlessly go on.
Now it's one until another.
Yep. And and they cross-infect each other as well. So you have this general sort of atmosphere of violence. And so it's changed in that way.
Maybe now is the time, Belle, you're obviously in the region reporting there now, and you're having to deal with this circumstance which Patrick's talking about, this increasing hostility towards journalists, maybe particularly Western journalists. Is that something that you find in your work day to day?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely sort of reiterate what Patrick was saying. I think particularly, as you were saying, with the rise of ISIS and also the Arab Spring, journalists very much became the target. And so it wasn't really a case of being caught in the crossfire, but rather actually being the target yourself. And that's impacted the way that we operate on the ground in terms of literally what you're wearing. I mean, where I actually based in Jerusalem, it's usually better to identify yourself as a journalist, so you wear, press on your flat jacket. But when you're in Egypt, you just need to keep your head down, or in my case, it didn't really work. But I think definitely that's something that we're having to deal with, and I don't think that's necessarily realised by the readers in terms of understanding what people go through in order to get the news.
Does it make you, in a way, more determined to do journalism in the Middle East because it comes with these extra challenges?
Yeah, I think so, and also it makes you try to be a little bit more responsible. So. To make it very clear, obviously I have a British passport and I'm white. So that offers me a lot of protection. The journalists that are really being impacted at the moment are people who we call local journalists, which is, as in they come from the countries that we're covering, and they often don't make the news. We're seeing mass roundup of journalists, Egyptian journalists, Turkish journalists, and that's something that I think readers also have to understand. Very recently, there was a Libyan photojournalist who was killed in southern Libya literally last week. He was actually a stringer for the Associated Press, but there was so little interest, and he was just shot dead doing really important coverage of an area that no one knows. Yeah. And I would just add to that, I mean, one of the questions that I'm often asked is, as a woman,
do you face extra challenges?
Do you face extra challenges? Yeah, it's a big question people ask me. What must be much harder to be female? And I'd say that I think that's another change that I've noticed in the region, that there is an increasing number of female correspondents, and that we play to our strengths. Like the common phrase I always say is that a bullet isn't gender specific, but actually it does help sometimes to be female, as I'm sure Patrick realizes. It's quite hard sometimes to talk to women. And as a woman, you can also hide. You can wear a headscarf, and you can wear a niqab, and you can literally vanish. So that does help. But definitely, just to finish one point, really, and we had a lot of, obviously very gruesome instances with ISIS, but I think that the phase that we're moving into now, because we're looking at a kind of post-Arab Spring mess, is really the rise of dictatorships and what that means for journalists on the ground. And unfortunately, I experienced that firsthand in February last year when I was deported. But I think we're seeing this a lot, and it's not necessarily hitting the headlines because it's not quite as headline grabbing as someone being decapitated, but it's something that we have to deal with. And I think it's something that it would be nice if readers would understand as well, because coverage is sometimes compromised if you're operating in an environment where you risk everything.
Yeah.
It doesn't help that when you have Donald Trump denouncing journalists as lying about everything, and all that gets picked up. You see fake facts suddenly being part of the propaganda of dictatorships in the region.
Absolutely.
To mention Donald Trump, I think we should move on to our first main topic, which is going to be, unfortunately, ISIS. We can get them out of the way, first of all. So obviously we've had Trump declaring victory over ISIS. He said in late December that they had won, and then that was the reason they could pull out US troops from Syria, which they haven't really started to do yet. So it looks like they may be backtracking on that slightly. But obviously you've seen ISIS since the beginning. You knew what was coming, in a way. Do you think Trump is premature in this?
I think one has to be sort of a bit careful about that. Anything to do with Trump is so divisive. People instantly condemn it, or in some cases applaud it. And one shouldn't necessarily do either. Because Trump may be in many ways an idiot. But, he also has a feel for what is actually happening. The fact that...
Do you think he does?
Oh, yeah. But he wouldn't be in president. His entire political career is based on people underestimating Donald Trump, which is in political instinct. It's not what he reads or anything like that. But I think that Islamic State, defeated or not, in one sense, yes. The height of its power, 2014-15, it ruled 8 million people. It ruled an area from the outskirts of Baghdad pretty well to the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
It was a real state. It raised taxes. It had a powerful army. Now it has one small town left.
Yeah, and it's losing that day by day.
Yup. So there is no doubt this is a major defeat. But can it continue as a guerrilla organization? The answer is yes.
We've had 2 attacks in the last week on US convoys in Syria, claimed by ISIS. I mean,
I mean, 2 things. One, they always said, what they recall is what happened to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, if you remember the famous surge when it was announced that they were finished, and they went and hid in the desert. had a low profile, and they came back. They're hoping to do that again. I don't think they can do that.
Why not?
Because people can see them coming. They had the great advantage of surprise last time, that nobody sort of knew these guys were there. Now people are hyper-conscious of them, so they knew. So I don't think it can be done. But that doesn't mean that they can't have guerrilla attacks. You know, they still have suicide bombers.
Yeah.
They can still do these things.
So you sort of predict some low-level guerrilla attacks in Iraq and Syria?
Yeah, one has to be careful about low-level, because some of these might be high-profile. They might be assassinations.
But you don't see the group regrouping as such?
It can't be what it was before, because, you know, its extreme violence generated so much hostility and so many enemies, often enemies who hated each other as well, but they hated ISIS more. That I think it's very difficult for them to come back in that way. But that doesn't mean they're going to go entirely out of business. And also, you know, a lot to do with ISIS is their ability to use terror attacks to generate enormous publicity. You know, they always occur in the middle of cities, in media hubs in Paris, so anything that happens gets maximum publicity. And they're capable of doing that. Not quite as capable as they were before. Was one of the things about the attacks of Charlie Hebdo and the massacre in Paris and so forth.
So you think they still do pose a threat to...
Yeah, but they don't have a state behind them. It was different before, that you had the money and the expertise and the weaponry from a state. But they could still certainly do that, and probably will do that, because they have an incentive to show that they're still in business.
And something we've also seen is groups in, whether it's North Africa or the Philippines or Afghanistan, sort of claiming the ISIS brand. And, I mean, is that going to continue, do you think? Is that
but it sort of, it depends. ISIS? Well, some of these groups will be, but will they be, you know, ISIS, what typified it? You know, it had an industrial supply of suicide bombers. This made it militarily effective. It made its terror attacks, killed a lot of people. Will these other groups be able to do that? They're not, you know, at the core of ISIS at the beginning were sort of, some of them have been former Iraqi army officers from Mosul, and most of them were Iraqis. They've been fighting a very long time. You know, what made them so effective in 2014? Well, one thing, that they'd been fighting, the Americans and others, for 10 years. And this made them a very effective fighting force. You know, why was Hezbollah in Lebanon so good? I remember asking one specialist in Lebanon about that, and they said, well, you've been fighting the Israelis for 15 years and you're still around. You're probably pretty good at your job. ISIS, the same thing.
But now they're running out of that manpower.
It's, at the top, they've lost a lot of people killed, but they still have some of them. Manpower in the region, eastern Syria, it's full of people, young men with no money, unemployed. If you have a bit of money, it's not that difficult to raise an army. Same in Yemen, same in a lot of these places. You've got complete economic devastation. People want to feed their families, you know. Some of the young men will go and fight, get $300 a month. Not very much, but it's better than nothing.
It's enough.
And I think, sorry to jump in there, but I think particularly with economic devastation at the moment, because of, I mean, the sort of war begets the war, if that makes sense, because you've got so many people living in, you know, displacement camps, because, I mean, one of the aspects I've been looking at recently is kind of environmental damage and how that fuels recruitment. But, you know, you've got vast areas of northern Iraq that are totally destroyed because of ISIS scorched tactics, which means that farmers don't have any work, and ISIS have used that in the past to recruit. So you could see that. And in terms of a diaspora, I mean, I think that it's really hard to tell right now, because before there was actually a direct line of communication between, let's say, ISIS in Libya that had a small kind of caliphate on the Mediterranean, or even ISIS in North Sinai, and they had a direct line of communication to Syria. It's unclear if that is still the case right now. And
whether there's a central command.
With the central command. I mean, Baghdadi in like Libya, for example, actually sent a Yemeni emir, one of his sort of right-hand men, over to Libya. And that was set up by a group of Libyan fighters who'd been fighting with ISIS in Syria, and they sort of brought it back. The franchise never really held, and that's what I think is really interesting about ISIS, is that the franchises aren't not the same as what's happening in Syria and Iraq. They can't quite inspire local sentiment in the same way. It's usually especially in Libya, the Libyans rejected it quite a bit. There was actually an internal uprising against ISIS when they controlled Derna. And it seems to be a confused organisation in North Sinai in Egypt as well. Like, people can't really tell who they have allegiances to. But it's a useful tag. If you want to commit a terror attack, even if it's a small one where only a few people die, if you attach the phrase ISIS to it, you instantly get more coverage.
More media coverage.
So, and I think, just echoing what Patrick said, I think that we're going to see more of these kind of, not necessarily smaller attacks, but kind of maybe lone wolf attacks.
Claimed by ISIS.
ISIS, yeah.
So you haven't convinced me that ISIS are over, but do you think there's no chance of another... The idea of a caliphate, that's not going to happen again.
Islamic State, this had great appeal, but lots of people had said, we're going to groups somewhat similar to ISIS, not quite so atrocious, had existed in the past, but not ones who said they're going to set up a state and do set up a state, and it's a very powerful state.
Yeah.
Now, their manic devotion to violence meant that they immediately had a great accumulation of enemies, so it didn't last that long. But it was very powerful, and they're the only people who have done that. Can they do that again? I don't think so. It was one of the key things was just the surprise element at the time, and that isn't there anymore.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think maybe we can move on from ISIS now and on to Syria. It seems like lots of observers and Syria watchers have kind of resigned themselves to the fact that Assad has won and that the war is winding down. Do you think that's a fair assessment, firstly?
Well, it's not. I mean, it's winding down, but there are various... It isn't what it was, and there isn't that amount of fighting. But, you still have in the northeast the Kurds, the Americans, what's going to happen there? Will the Turks invade? Now, if the Turks come across the border, the Kurds generally live on cities just south of the border. I mean, the Turkish Syrian border is the old railway line between Aleppo and Mosul, which they just drew on the map, which went through cities that were Kurdish. So you have Kurds on both sides of the border. If the Turks move south, I mean, there are about 2 million Kurds in that area. They'll all run. This will be a mass exodus. And we've already seen that in Afrin. This was an area that the Turks invaded last year, and half the population have gone and aren't able to get back. So that is the sort of big calamity that could still happen.
But in terms of Assad staying?
Oh, yeah, I think that's been true for a long time. I think people it was wish fulfillment or imagining it he'd go. I thought from 2012 he's not going to go because he had more allies than the others, because for many reasons. I should say that one gets people ask one about this. And one thing that always happens in journalism is, people mistake explanation for justification.
Right.
This isn't a justification for Assad, but it is an explanation.
Yeah. No, I think that's the interesting thing, because in the early days of the Arab Spring, we saw leaders either being pushed out or resigning, but he was sort of determined to stay, and he's made it work for himself. And 8 years later, we've had 500,000 people dead, half the population has been displaced or made refugees, but he's managed to stay on. How has he done that? You say he has more allies?
Yeah, initially he had more support, because Syria is a very sectarian country. I mean, this is an Alawite regime, which is sort of a Shia sect, and they were always going to fight. I mean, basically, if you take 15% Kurds who got alien, didn't like Assad, but they were even more terrified of ISIS. You've got about 39–40% who belong to the minorities. They were never going to accept the overthrow. In the cities, you have people who worked for the government. So there was always support there.
Yeah.
The way I've always looked at Syria is there's always a choice between bad and worse for a lot of Syrians.
Yeah. But that's something that's quite interesting to me, is that we have all these refugees, 6 million maybe outside of the country. Are they going to be persuaded to return? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think the UN would hope that they would, and a lot of the neighbouring countries would hope. I think the UN said they estimated, I think it's like 250,000 they think might return this year.
I mean, for a lot of those Syrians, they don't even have, their houses have been maybe overtaken.
Well,
I mean, what they're returning
there's
to.
practical problems here. You've got landmines scattered all over the country or unexploded ordnances. You've got destruction of houses. You've got lack of infrastructure. They've also, you had people returning, I think a few sort of tens of thousands have returned to places like Dera and things like that. But, you know, people have gone missing because of affiliations that they had. There's also I mean, when speaking to, I've been in and out of refugee camps a lot in the last 5 months.
Some in Jordan.
Iraq, like different places. And the sort of overwhelming point is, I mean, a lot of them have boys, you know, that are now of military age. They don't want to go into the military. I mean, you've also, it's absolute chaos. You've got so many children who are born outside of Syria who don't even have proper identification, and they don't have a proper, but at the same time, they don't have a proper living environment where they are. I mean, there's...
Yeah, what are these people going to do? I mean, obviously, Assad wants to sort of project this image that Syria is safe and everything's fine and they should come back, but they don't want to. Some of them don't want to return. So
I think what happens, you know, in these places, first of all, if you're a refugee for long enough, somebody may take over your property, just individually. Yeah. I mean, I remember in Iraq in about 2006, I had somebody working for me as a driver. Yeah. He was a Sunni. He had a house in a sort of basically Shia area in Baghdad. He moved to Syria for a year for safety, came back. And the neighbors said, he saw that his house was occupied, and the neighbors said, get out of here quickly, because a family's taken over, Shia family's taken over your house, they've denounced you as a agent for Saddam, secret police agent, Mukhabarat, and they'll kill you if they find you. No, he wasn't, he was just a simple driver.
Yeah, and just lost
so he lost his house, all he had in the world. And you have that all over the place, that houses are taken over, and if you wait long enough time passes, people can't get them back.
Yeah. And it seems like in Syria there's been some quite forced sort of population movements by the government or by local authorities, quite in a deliberate way.
Yeah, it's, you know, you had that before, you know, the way the regime was set up. You'd see sort of Alawites in some areas, in rather strategic areas. Saddam used to do the same thing in Baghdad, where was Sunni, where was Shia. They all knew the sectarian of their geography of their countries very well, and were manipulated to secure them in power. Also, you go back to Syria at the moment, you know, as you were saying, a lot of it's, you know, Damascus, central Damascus, not too bad, but you go up on the Euphrates, and the Euphrates last year, you know, the main hydroelectric dams weren't working. No electricity, that means no electricity to pump the water. So around Raqqa, this you could see, it all used to be heavily irrigated, and but you can see all the drainage ditches, but they're empty. And you see herds of sheep everywhere. Yeah. So it's sort of reverting to pasture and semi-desert. So there aren't sort of jobs for people. What are they going to do if they come back?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of reconstruction to be done.
Yeah, you see that in places. Some of these places, you know, they've got relatives who work in Saudi Arabia, you know, so you see that happening in some places. But depends how long. You know, some places... sort of outside Baghdad, you see some places that were devastated being rebuilt. Most people think things are fairly secure. But places like Raqqa, very little, because people think, you know, I'll rebuild my house, I'll be knocked down again. People need a degree of security before they start rebuilding.
And something you mentioned briefly, but I want to go back to, is the Kurdish region in northern Syria, Rojava. Obviously, there's the Turkey question, but do you think Damascus will really allow that to be a fully...
How are they going to stop it, you know? The Kurds, you know, they see they're not naive and they don't trust anybody, certainly not the Americans in the past. Now they're saying, oh, we believed every word the Americans were saying, but actually they didn't. Because I talked it over with them. But it was difficult to see what their options were. They needed the Americans, and above all the American Air Force. People talk about these 2,000 Americans in northeast Syria. That does not really count very much. What counts is that they can call in the sort of devastating air power of the US Air Force. So they needed the Americans, but the Americans stopped them talking to Damascus. But they need to get Syrian troops back on the border and the Americans to stop the Turks coming in. Turkish army could certainly push the Syrian army out of the way. So it's an appalling dilemma for them. And it's not immediately obvious what the answer is. But I think that anybody who says, you know, whatever the Turks say about, you know, we'll only deal with the terrorists, but actually it turns out practically every Kurd is a terrorist in their eyes. And one saw this in Afrin. This isn't just propaganda.
So Turkey won't allow this Rojava to continue?
One way or another, they were always, that's the sort of central focus of their policy. But whether it'll end up with a sort of a drive south, they say this sort of security zone, but actually that includes most of the populated areas. Will it be that, or will it be some sort of something a bit more benign, where the Syrian government troops come in on the border and
so Turkey and Syria come to an agreement where Syria sort of...
Something like that, but
Okay.
then, you know, they're still at daggers drawn, so it's not obvious how this is going to happen.
Yeah.
And also, you know, what is American policy? You know, it's obviously completely divided between what Trump says and what the rest of the administration does.
Yeah. Maybe quite a difficult question, but what do you think Syria might look like in 10 years? Obviously, we think Assad's going to stay. Do we think there will be any sort of accountability or any transitional justice or anything like that, or do you think that's a bit too optimistic?
I think that's probably a little bit too optimistic, simply because we haven't seen any transitional justice anywhere, really, in the Middle East region. I think it doesn't really matter if Assad has popularity on the ground or not. You know, there was obviously a large part of the society that was that he was unpopular with. There was an uprising, it failed. And I think he's going to be able to play the card that, you know, either you bolster, you know, me and my friends, Russia and Iran, or you deal with the nightmare of extremist groups and
everyone's now seen what that
seen what that's like. And so I think, you know, from the perspective of the US, they're going to be more concerned about trying to deal with how they handle, you know, the Kurdish issues, as Patrick was just talking about, rather than setting up transitional justice courts to hold Assad regime officials, you know, accountable. So I think that's what's probably most terrifying for civilians in Syria who's lost or whose family members have just vanished, or who, you know, may have been involved in the uprising, and that's one of the things that's going to hold people back from returning. But, you know, in the end, the only way that I think there could have been any chance of Assad being removed from power is if there was an equally strong intervention from the other side, and that would have seen a bloodbath, to be honest. You would have had to have had, you know, I mean, the number of planes and troops from the Russians that intervened in Syria was huge. If you were to have this equivalent on the other side, which I guess would probably be the States, you know, we would have seen basically kind of Cold War happening. So he's got the advantage of basically being the only guy, and the other side is being this terrifying mess that, you know, morphed into ISIS and other armed groups. And at the same time, you know, in terms of the West, they're more concerned about what they're going to do with their Kurdish allies and how they can prevent another massive war happening.
And obviously, Russia's been very key to Assad's success, and they have a growing presence in the country. They have their own airbase in Latakia, which they have signed a 50-year lease on, I think, and I think they're going to be heavily involved in the reconstruction. So the next 10 years for you, do you see a growing Russian presence in Syria? And what about Iran as well?
Well, to a degree, but I mean, the Syrians needed them when they were under severe pressure in the Syrian government. Under less pressure, how much will they need the Russians? Same to do with Iran. For the Russians, I think that's just a broader thing, that Syria, their successful intervention in Syria, put them back in business as a sort of superpower. Now, people often say they weren't a superpower before. Well, hold on a minute. They were always a nuclear superpower. They could have blown up the world. One has to keep this in mind. But this was their big success. Remember, in Libya, nobody much cared what the Russians thought or did. Since Syria, suddenly they're back at the top table. So that was their big success, and they're not going to let that go away. So yeah, I think they'll be there, but you know, bases and all that other stuff, I think that's pretty secondary.
Can I add a point in here? Just think, I think Syria is going to need help reconstructing the country, and I don't think they can do it without Russia and Iran, because I mean, the Syrian army is a rag-bag mess now after this many years. You know, they've also been taking a huge pounding as well. You know, obviously there's no, I don't know, you know, the economic situation of Syria is pretty bad, so they're going to need as much help as they possibly can to you know, shore up the regime, even if there is no one else there. And so this is actually sort of moving into where I am based in Jerusalem, a big issue that Israel is facing, because Iran is also going to be needed in terms of literally policing areas, because there are going to be, extremist groups everywhere or rebel groups. So
it's likely that Iranian forces will stay in Syria on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, they want to anyway, because there's also both sides.
It's good for them, isn't it?
Yeah, they've invested a huge amount of money. And again, it's sort of been a very helpful playing field for Iran. But this is the biggest dilemma that Israel's facing, because they don't want to intervene in Syria. They don't really care if Assad stays or doesn't. But at the same time, Assad needs the Iranians and needs the Russians, because literally they can't put the country back together again, which means there will be at least Iranian military infrastructure there, and that's what they're trying to do, and that's the biggest fear from the Israeli side.
It's on their border.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on now to Yemen. Obviously, you have been there this recent year, 2018, so you can tell us a little bit. Obviously, the UN's called it the world's worst humanitarian crisis. I think official death count has somewhere around 10,000, but it's probably a lot higher.
It's meant to be around 60,000, yeah. And that doesn't include the death toll from starvation or cholera or any of the other humanitarian, yeah.
So if you can just tell us a little bit about what it was like to go there and see that firsthand.
I mean, the areas of Yemen that I was in was actually not on the front line between the Houthi rebel group and the government, but actually in the south, where ISIS used to hold land and doesn't anymore, and also groups like Al-Qaeda. But what I think was the most interesting thing for me, so whenever we talk about it, and I think this might actually be the fault of the media, we talk a lot about the Saudi-led coalition.
I'll take some notes.
Yeah. So we talk a lot about the Saudi Arabia-led coalition, who has a partner called the UAE, but there wasn't ever really, the role of the UAE was never really explained, and that's what I really saw firsthand in southern Yemen, because the UAE has rolled out quite an impressive military infrastructure for a country that up until very recently didn't have much of a foreign policy in that sense. And so I think, what was really interesting for me wasn't so much about the updates on the front line between the war that we all were trying to follow, but was actually what's going to happen next. And
so between the Saudis and the Emiratis?
Yeah, so, in terms of boots on the ground, the Saudis have presence in the centre, but basically southern Yemen is mostly policed by the UAE, who've trained up, I think they said 60,000 local forces. And a lot of those forces are southern separatists. And of course, Yemen was only united in 1990, I think is the year. There was a kind of war for a year after that. So, and for the southerners, it was actually a bad deal. And now they're seeing their chance. And I think what's interesting I've noticed is, a lot of the southern separatist leaders, like the former leader of the Yemen, southern Yemen, are actually in the UAE at the moment. They have really impressive military infrastructure all across the south, including around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is a very strategic waterway that basically controls traffic going up to the Suez Canal. So we're talking about controlling water traffic from, I guess, Asia through to Europe, I think, So
for them, it's an economic thing. You think it's their interest is in the...
I think it's many things, but I don't want to sort of. I think jumping to conclusions is obviously very dangerous. But certainly they have military bases on either side of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, including in Eritrea, which I also visited, and it was a seriously impressively well-stocked base. And I think they really do have a lot of infrastructure on the ground. The Saudis, I think, are just very concerned about having this Shia rebel group on their borders, which has been exciting the sort of Shia minorities in the eastern parts of Saudi Arabia. So,
what I'm kind of interested in is what will Saudi Arabia be satisfied with? What will the Houthis in Iran be satisfied with to see this? We have Martin Griffiths, the UN envoy for Yemen, in the country today. How can they reach this permanent peace solution? What will satisfy the two sides?
Well, it's kind of, a lot of it's what the US does. And we had this ceasefire at Hodeidah, the crucial port on the Red Sea, really, I think, essentially because of American pressure, but pressure on Saudi Arabia and UAE to bring that to a halt. I think what's really changed is what's changed in America, that you have Congress now, and this will increase with the House controlled by the Democrats, more and more hostile, vigorously hostile to the Saudis post-Khashoggi. That's a big change. That puts the administration under pressure. So previously you had this war, which was kind of in the shadows, but now it's sort of it's plugged into political struggles in Washington, which means that it's going to be kept on, the Senate votes for, in a way, hostile to Saudi Arabia. The House will be even more so. So that's the really big change.
So you think that US pressure, which has been increasing since Khashoggi's murder, will help the war come to an end sooner?
No, well, then when it come to an end. I was saying earlier on that I have noticed over the last couple of decades that all these wars in the Middle East just don't come to an end. I can't think of any that have come to an end. 2001, I was covering the war in Afghanistan. People announced that it could come to the end when the Taliban disappeared. But a bit later, the Taliban come romping back. It hadn't ended.
Sorry, Karen.
So I think that will sort of go on. But will it be quite so bad? We had sort of millions of people on the edge of starvation. Well, maybe not.
But do you think there's any chance? Obviously, you've written a bit about the Southern Transitional Council, and do you think there's any chance that Yemen might split again?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it already has split.
I think it already has split. I mean, I would just add to that. What's interesting about the Yemen war is that it was basically the first thing that Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince that we all know about of Saudi Arabia, ordered when he became defense minister at the age of, I think he was just 31, 32, yeah. And for the Saudis and for the Emiratis, they genuinely thought that it was going to be a quick in, quick out instance. And as we all know about wars in the Middle East, it wasn't that. And I think there's actually a Yemeni phrase that, people never win the war in Yemen. Partly because, and actually the US are having trouble with this as well, it's such a complex environment. I mean, the US drone strikes keep hitting civilians because, Al-Qaeda is deeply enmeshed within tribes in Yemen. It's very hard to sort of separate these groups out.
The militants from the civilians.
Yeah. So, and the thing is, basically the problem is that Saudi doesn't want to have a Shia group on its borders, and the Houthis, don't want to leave. If we also have a split Yemen with the southern separatists in the south, they're very happy for basically the Houthis and Hadi and whoever to be in the north. But where does that leave?
Saudi Arabia still wouldn't be satisfied with that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the war has definitely come out of the shadows, which is...
Because it's nearly been 4 years, but it feels like a lot of people have only noticed it since Khashoggi.
And that's actually been quite frustrating as a journalist because, I've tried to write about Yemen since the beginning, and the problem is that it was always seen as a bit of an obscure war, like what's Yemen, who cares about the Saudis,
it was always the poorest country in the Middle East, everyone always kind of thought that...
And then the numbers just got so huge. I mean, there's 13 million people that the UN say could starve to death. 85,000 children under the age of 5 have likely died from starvation since the war began. You've got 3/4 of the population who are relying on humanitarian aid. I mean, and the thing is, no one can get out. The reason I think also we didn't have this being published about is that there were no refugees because people can't leave Yemen. So this nightmare was just kind of corralled within this country. But it's got to the point where, it's just pockets of famine, epidemics of diseases. And at the same time, Saudi's becoming an unpopular-ish partner. But the problem is, where do we go from now? I mean, already peace talks that happened in Jordan haven't been going very well. There's supposed to be a prisoner swap, 15,000 different prisoners on each side. That they can't agree on that. And there's been a lot of distrust in Hodeidah. It was meant to be a withdrawal from Hodeidah. It hasn't really happened. So
at the moment, you kind of see the stalemate continuing.
It depends. I think a lot of it depends on the US. And what pressure it puts on the Saudis and the UAE, and what pressure, the pressure they put on the so-called government of Yemen, but actually since they give them the orders and pay them, it's not exactly pressure, but it's instructions. So I think it'll all depend on that. But again, it's a very fragmented situation. It always has. You can never conquer Yemen, but there's no government to conquer.
Right.
You can conquer Denmark, but there's a government to overthrow. You can take over, but you can't do it in Yemen. And difficult to do it in Lebanon, because there's no government you can knock on the head. So I think that will go on. But at what level? There's an enormous difference between a war going on and a war where millions of people may suddenly die, quite quickly.
Okay, well, I think that brings us nicely to, unfortunately, Donald Trump. We are talking about the Middle East, but I think it's hard to avoid the man. Obviously, when he became president, his first foreign trip was to Riyadh and then to Jerusalem. We've seen him scrap the Iran nuclear deal, move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and obviously what's happening in Syria. If we talk firstly about the Iran nuclear deal, obviously the US pulled out, and the UK and the European partners, they stood by it, and they defended Iran against the charges the US was making. Do you think actually in a way Trump pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal has empowered the government in Iran, or the regime there, and that it's given them a moral high ground.
Yeah, well, yeah, but a lot of people have sort of had the moral high ground and sort of have died shortly afterwards. You know, it doesn't necessarily get you very far in this world or the next. You know, so it's you know, so it's bad news for them, but they have sanctions. You know,
obviously it's affecting civilians in Iran.
It affects civilians.
Yeah.
Sanctions generally, that's what it does, affect civilians. You know, 13 years of sanctions against Saddam, who really suffered.
Yeah.
Not Saddam. He and his family spent all their time building palaces. You know. But civilians, and usually, you know, who dies? And they say it's the very weak. You know, it's very small children.
The youngest or the oldest. Yeah.
It's the eldest. It's the most vulnerable. So, so I don't think that has that effect. They've also, you know, it's not the same as sanctions were under Obama, where they're much more international sanctions. You know, then there are big companies that can't do business there. But you know, when very small companies see that a big company can't do business, you know, they'll try and do it themselves.
Yeah.
So, and maybe they don't have interest in the US, so they're less vulnerable. But, you know, the US Treasury is very powerful. They can, you know, you'll see that, you know, with companies in Baghdad, you know, banks really frightened that the US Treasury will jump on them. So they don't want to do business with Iran, or they want to do it in some peculiar way. So it's, you know, what is Trump's objective? I think one thing about Trump, I mean, he is a genuine isolationist. It's not true of the guys around him, but he's a genuine isolationist. What's the purpose of all this? I think rather like he used to sort of make big threats against North Korea, probably he does feel at some point he can do a deal. And he will say, this is a better deal than Obama.
Okay, so you think that's where he's going with this whole Iran being the biggest enemy? You think eventually they're going to become...
Yeah, but I think that, you know, you look at watch CNN and the New York Times and Washington Post, the hatred of Trump is so extreme that they don't, you know, it's not withdrawal from Syria. It's not actually a great idea for the US to be basically a small player stuck up in northeast Syria with lots of other contenders. Now one can argue, and I would argue, that pulling out just like that and leaving the Kurds to the mercy of the Turks is not a great idea.
Yeah.
But overall, the idea of staying is not a feasible policy either. And opponents of Trump sort of say we have to stay, but they don't take on board these various reasons for not staying.
Yeah.
You know, then again, overall, quite a certain amount of what Trump does makes sense. And in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, you know, Saudis are much more dependent on Trump, because who supports the Crown Prince? Not Congress, you know, but Trump does.
Yeah.
That they sort of have to do what he says.
Well, that was the next thing I wanted to speak to you about, was specifically Mohammed bin Salman and Trump's support for him. And then, obviously, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in October, which the Saudi regime have, you know, put on rogue elements. Do you think Trump's support for MBS, in a way, emboldened him in ways?
Oh, yeah, I think so. You know, I think it went to their head. You know, almost from the beginning, he upped the intervention in Syria and backed a sort of opposition offensive that led to the Russians coming in. He started the war in Yemen. You know, initially it was called Decisive Storm. You know, they're still there. Basically, whatever he thought he was doing, he hasn't done it.
Yeah.
You know, there's a strong element of sort of Inspector Clouseau, you know, as well as sort of Saddam Hussein in MBS, I think. And this doesn't seem to have changed. Or to Khashoggi, it doesn't seem to have changed the way he operates.
I mean, before Khashoggi, obviously MBS was being sort of lauded as the new face of the progressive Saudi Arabia. And it seems to be, we don't quite know what's going to happen, but is he going to remain as powerful as he once was? Or do you think the House of Saud are kind of trying to make him less powerful?
I think they're spending loads of time trying to make him less powerful. But once somebody's got hold of the sort of security apparatus in any Middle East country or anywhere in the world, it's very difficult to lever them out of power, particularly if you want a sort of controlled revolution. The House of Saud doesn't want a sort of general revolution, but there are lots of people who obviously want to get rid of him. Will it happen? You know, you just can't tell.
Yeah.
But there's no doubt, you know, pretty well everything he's done hasn't worked. You know, the new economic vision and so forth.
I mean,
these are very, you know, all these oil states in the Middle East, you know, they're big patronage machines. You know, in Iraq, you have 4 million people work for the government. That's the crucial thing. They need $4 billion a month to pay the people who work for the government. That's what keeps the regime in business. All the other oil states, Libya used to be the same, work in approximately the same way. It's very dangerous to mess with this, which what he was doing. You can always get Western consultants to say what a jolly good idea it is, you know, to, that you should have real efficiency and so forth. But this, either deliberately or not, misunderstands the politics of it. So will he mess with that? Well, he tried to do that. It didn't really come off.
Do you think their sort of reform agenda will come to the forefront again? And you know, they lifted the driving ban on women, but at the same time they were jailing Saudi women activists.
This is all superficial stuff, I think. You know, driven by PR companies and so forth. One, I don't think that MBS is any good at this. I'm not sure he's sincere at this. But one should also say it's very, very difficult to do in any resource-rich state. They're all a bit the same, whether it's Angola or Iraq or Saudi Arabia. You have an elite that can plug themselves into the oil revenues, become super rich, and buy, you know, enormous yachts and so forth. You have another chunk of the population that gets sort of jobs. They don't really do much work. It's very difficult to change that.
So you think there was no genuine desire for reform from the top anyway?
Oh, I'm sure there was a desire for a sort of something that looked like reform, and they may have believed this stuff. But when you look at the record of all these oil states, when they've announced splendid reforms, it's never taken. Oil seems to be, you know, it's like a pine forest. Nothing grows underneath. As soon as you have oil, it destroys other elements of the economy.
Yeah.
You know, you go to the market in Baghdad, you look at the goods. They all come, you know, they're Turkish or they're Chinese, and they've all come from Iran or Turkey. There's almost nothing is indigenous, you know, because everything costs too much to make locally and so forth. So I always thought it was really wishful thinking for anybody to imagine that you could have reform in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. If we move to Trump's promised deal of the century for Israel-Palestine, there have been sort of leaks about it for months, and we're not quite sure when it's going to come out. The Palestinians, Mahmoud Abbas, has already rejected the deal and said that he doesn't really trust that Trump can come up with anything.
He's cut ties with the US, yeah.
So what do you think Trump has in store, and what is going to change?
It's a $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, there's some discussion about this all taking place after the elections. So Netanyahu called snap elections for the 9th of April for many different reasons, which we can go into. The problem is that because of Trump's decision to move the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, thereby basically recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which is meant to be a final status issue and at the heart of the conflict. And he almost did that in a sort of way that was sort of quite a kind of throwaway way. And also because he cut huge amounts of funding to the United Nations refugee program for Palestinians and funding to East Jerusalem hospitals and everything. Basically, the Palestinians don't see the US as mediators or brokers anymore.
So no deal could be a deal worth taking into...
I think you can bring a deal and show it to people, but, you know, essentially you're just standing there with a piece of paper. I think, you know, I mean, the Palestinians have made this very, very clear that they don't regard the US as basically being able to say as an honest negotiator, yeah, and that's their stance right now, and they've actually cut kind of diplomatic ties in that regard. And of course, you know, there's a big winner from this has been Netanyahu. I'm not sure, it's very hard to say whether actually Trump is necessarily super pro Netanyahu or whether it's more a case of he just doesn't care so much. So last year we saw record high tenders for settlements. So settlements in the West Bank are deemed illegal under international law, and our government at least regards them to be illegal. That's obviously quite a big part of kind of Israel's plan for the West Bank, is to basically essentially chop it up. And, you know, it's not a coincidence that this was the same year that the embassy was moved and the UNRWA cuts were happening.
Netanyahu has also been emboldened by Trump.
He's been emboldened, yeah, and Trump hasn't necessarily said hurrah for settlements, but he hasn't at least had any pushback. And this is not to say the Obama administration was particularly wonderful. Settlement, had different levels of growth during the Obama administration, but there was still a line that was very, very, drawn in the sand, and that has disappeared now. And then of course you have the other problem is from within the Palestinians. So there's a big rift at the moment between Fatah, which is the political party that dominates the Palestinian Authority that's based in the West Bank, and Hamas, which has a militant wing and runs the Gaza Strip. We're seeing such a massive breakdown in relations between those two sides, to the point where in 2017 and last year, Mahmoud Abbas actually strangled electricity to Gaza. It's causing catastrophic, problems in terms of humanitarian situation, and also cut salaries, which is, Gaza has one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. So when you cut salaries, it causes massive trouble. And I can't really see how that rift is going to be fixed. So even if you did come to the table with some amazing peace plan for Israel, Palestine, what is Palestine? And, and that's another big issue because of the kind of encroachment on the West Bank. In terms of land grabs and settlement expansion. And it's not necessarily, I'm talking about particular geographical expansion, but actually strategic one. So last year, one of the biggest headlines was about this tiny Bedouin village called Khan al-Ahmar that literally has a few dozen people living in it, but it's strategically placed between two settlements in the West Bank, and they want to connect the dots and then connect it through to Jerusalem, which would literally split the West Bank in half. So there's been a lot of strategic growth in those terms. So even if you had a perfect deal, how would you deal with that with the fight within the Palestinians? And then how would you deal with that in terms of the reality on the ground? Which, and when you've got the US, who's meant to be the biggest mediator, even questioning what the concept of a refugee is, it's a disaster. And meanwhile, we really are having a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. According to the UN, next year, Gaza will be uninhabitable. Like, people will not be able to live there because the situation will be so bad. And
but at the same time, they have nowhere else to go.
They have nowhere else to go. Egypt is sporadically opening borders, but you have to spend maybe $1,000, $2,000 to get yourself on the list. And in the interim, you've got 2.2 million people that are corralled into a 25-mile long stretch.
It's the most densely populated place on Earth.
Place on Earth, yeah, absolutely. And you have a youth. If you're 10 years old in Gaza, you've lived through three wars already. That doesn't make a very healthy population. And even from the Israeli perspective, this is a national security threat for them. So there are NGOs that are working on that to try and explain that a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and if it does become uninhabitable by next year, is going to spill over to Israel, and this is going to complicate any hope for a deal of the century or anything. Yeah.
Just lastly on Trump, what do you think his legacy will be in the Middle East?
I think, no, I'm going to say something nice about Trump.
Okay.
How good was the legacy of his predecessors?
Right.
Not great, He hasn't actually started any wars there yet. The others,
2 more years, at least.
Yeah, but I don't think, I think there obviously is a big difference between him and the people around him, but I don't think he has a long history of isolationism, and that obviously appeals to a big chunk of the American population. So what would be the legacy? Well, things have, they've got hotter, but not that amount hotter, The Americans are still in Afghanistan, the Taliban are doing quite well. What was his policy in Iraq? It was very much the same as Obama. As regards the Palestinians, as regards the Israelis.
That might be the biggest area.
Yeah,
maybe.
but he's doing overtly what the others did covertly, which was, backing a two-state solution while this was being not just eroded, but completely eliminated by the settlers. So you couldn't have a state require something to stand on. If you could have a, two-state solution in which the Israelis have all the land and everything else, and the Palestinians don't have anywhere to stand or anywhere to eat.
Kind of negates the option.
Yeah, this is a meaningless thing. Yeah. So I think that a lot of these things were sort of, not moving the embassy. A lot of these things were sort of, to my mind.
So he's just being more honest.
Well, not honestly straightforward, but I think it stripped away a lot of the camouflage of a lot of these things. I mean, the problem is, the disparity in power between the Palestinians and the Israelis is so great that it's very difficult to see any negotiation coming out of that. It's one of the reasons Oslo eventually failed and was never really going anywhere. On the other hand, whatever the Israelis do, until they have an agreement by the Palestinians that things are okay, the conflict hasn't ended. Mm-hmm. They can't really end it. So it goes on and on. So they have all this power, but somehow it doesn't bring them political victory at the end of the day. Mm. But going back to Trump, I don't think necessarily, when he comes to this 4 years, it's going to be that bad. But with the proviso that what his predecessors did was not that good and was often disastrous. As you say, a couple of years to go.
Well, let's hope it doesn't get much worse. See.
I'm not sure he's got a plan. I mean, I think that's one. I mean, he learnt about Idlib. He said this on Twitter. He learnt that Idlib was a thing because a woman mentioned it in a rally, and then he read the false New York Times. Is that what he said? The fake news New York Times.
Failing New Times.
Yeah, the fake New York Times. And even the embassy move really just felt like I don't think he understood what Jerusalem means.
He didn't know the weight of that decision.
Yeah, and as I said, he hasn't been supporting settlements. He just doesn't. They just don't cross his radar. Yeah. He suddenly announced that we're going to pull out of Syria. I think that what will define his role in the Middle East is the fact that he doesn't appear to have a plan, and that he is an isolationist. That's probably why he doesn't really have a plan. I don't think he has. And that's why I think, although Netanyahu's been sort of emboldened by what looks like American support, I think it's more just the fact that he doesn't really have much thought other than what has been taken for granted before. So, but that is like a bull in a china shop in some instances, like unpredictability, like the backlash from the
Did Hillary Clinton have a plan? I mean, if she did, it was a jolly bad one. But
maybe not a plan. An ideology is perhaps what I'm trying to say here. I think. Plan or no plan, people had ideas about things, and I think that he, in his action, literally learning about what Idlib was from an article, just shows what he. I think it's more that's going to cause problems because he does make these decisions.
Yeah, well, also when you look at CNN or something and you see these sort of so-called experts going on about Idlib, they sort of know where Idlib is and so forth. But after a bit, you realise they've never set foot in Syria, and they haven't the slightest idea what they're talking about. It's not actually that. They may sound better than Trump, who's just discovered there exists such a place as Idlib. But actually...
None of us know what we're talking about.
No, that's not true. If you particularly go to sort of the expertise, the sort of Washington think tanks, they're really all about Washington politics, nothing to do with the Middle East. Their ideas of what should be done are just as destructive, perhaps more destructive than those of Trump. This isn't exactly a defense of Trump, but often that his opponents, because he doesn't know sort of simple facts like that their arguments begin to get a credibility, which they don't really deserve. Right. They also are pretty clueless about what they should do.
They're better at sounding like they know what they're talking about.
They've got the patter right, but they don't actually know anything.
I mean, what I'm trying to say is it's not necessarily better to have an idea or a plan. It's just that I think people think he has much more ideology about the Middle East region than he does, or knowledge. And I think that in his actions, and that's what can be dangerous, because I think he obviously did cause a lot of, I don't know what the word is, upset when he suddenly announced they were withdrawing from Syria. I think him suddenly questioning, I think in terms of the parts of the world that I cover, I think what's concerning is that he's obviously easily swayed by what people tell him and does make decisions. And I think, suddenly announcing that he doesn't agree with the definition of a refugee in terms of Israel-Palestine doesn't necessarily come from someone who's deeply thought that for a long time. I think it just came to him. And I think that's what's going to define his policy in the Middle East, is it's not going to be driven by a particular goal. It's just, a bit scattered.
We've got one more topic to get to, and we have to do questions, but I would quickly want to just ask you, Patrick, about British influence in the Middle East. Obviously, you covered the 2003 war in Iraq.
Well, it's interesting that, and rather depressing, there isn't more talk about this. In 2003, Britain joined the invasion of Iraq with 40,000 troops. They had up to 2009, they had troops in Basra and so forth. 2011, David Cameron, played a big role in initiating the NATO attack on Gaddafi and so forth. But nothing, first of all, it's not talked about at all now. All these things were pretty, did not work. What happened to the British Army in Basra, as the Chilcot report made very clear, was, pretty humiliating. They ended up being stuck in an air base. So I wish it did, because I think there's a sort of disconnect when everybody talks about Brexit, what happens to Britain now. And these other issues are never raised. I mean, the answer is British influence is pretty minimal. It's basically going behind the, following along behind the Americans.
Yeah, and
as
sort of
in
soft
the past.
power. And
But less influential than 10 or 15 years ago.
Do you think that will increase post-Brexit?
No, I don't see why it should. I mean, you have to think of a jolly good reason why it should. But there are lots of other players there. That there was there's an element of fantasy, wishful thinking. I remember a few years ago, should Britain join in and bomb Syria?
After the chemical attack?
Yeah, but discussion, was this going to be a one-off, or were we going to have a sustained military attack on Syria, for which we had, very few planes and so forth? And, I remember Hilary Benn got up in the House of Commons and said we were going to fight them on the beaches and so forth. And this was like the Spanish Civil War. And all this bit, which to my mind is sort of fantasy and detached from the real world. No, I don't see why Britain, there are many other players there with powerful armies, with powerful economies. Why should Britain be able to expand its influence there? Particularly when, what in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, these previous policies, very obviously failed.
Yeah.
But I think it is interesting and that these things are practically not discussed at the moment. Although, the Chilcot report is very good and very clear on this.
Yeah. Just if we can talk about Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe briefly, because obviously that's something where British power maybe hasn't helped her at all. I mean, obviously we saw Boris Johnson's comments about her, she and her family maintained that she was not training journalists, and then Boris Johnson just went out and said that she had been. Do you think in a way our British lack of power in the Middle East sort of allows these things to happen, whereby she's now been in jail for over 2 years?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, according to the family of Nazanin, and I know her husband, Richard, very well now because I've been covering this since she was taken in 2016, he believes that she's been held as a bargaining chip over basically unpaid bills and the UK stretching back to 70s, yeah. And I think maybe it's an example more of the fact that the Brits just don't want to, and I think this plays into what Patrick is saying, just don't want to have their head above water, really. We just want to be sort of behind the scenes all the time. And these kinds of big dramatic events, we're not going to put our neck on the line for a single person. And I think, apart from when Boris made that disastrous comment, and I think, I think that's perhaps an example of how we are in the Middle East region. I mean,
clumsy.
Yeah, a bit clumsy, and we're trying to keep things quiet. So, for example, I think to a certain extent, I guess it's been a bit successful. I mean, everyone has a go at the US for different support of different regimes or whatever. But, and especially, let's say, Egypt was obviously a country I was living in for many, many years. The US was constantly getting battered for, military aid to an oppressive regime. But the single largest investor in Egypt is the UK right now. And we're increasing that investment year on year, and we're doing lots of military exercises, and there's a lot of connection there. That is just not made public, and I think that's really, in my opinion, where the Brits are going. We just keep, all these big interventions, we just landed with, to use a stupid phrase, egg on our face, and the British public has got very upset about it. So I think their strategy right now, including with Nazanin, is basically just to keep quiet. Yeah. And certainly I know. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of families of people who are behind bars, and I guess I sort of experienced it myself personally, because obviously Boris actually made a phone call for me, which I don't know was
that help.
This is being live streamed, so I mean, I'm very grateful because I wasn't harmed, and I did think I was going to be harmed at one point, and I wasn't, and it's all fine. But a lot of families have expressed frustration because the Brits say, keep quiet, don't take it to the public, keep it quiet. And Richard has actually gone out on a limb with his wife, going so public. And we've talked personally, about the difficulties of that. And, certainly in my instance, it was, we kept the media off it for a whole month. And it was definitely about, keeping our head below the water. And that does help. It does mean that people are not, pointing the finger of blame at the UK. But I think that doesn't mean that we don't have relationships with some of these less pleasant regimes. But I think, as Patrick said, Libya was a disaster, Iraq was a disaster, all of these things are disastrous. And so, yeah.
It's a very small thing. It's not obvious what you do when you have people held, sort of basically arrested, almost pretty well held as hostages. Jason Rezaian, who was a Washington Post correspondent, was held. I know him quite well. In Iran, how exactly do you get somebody out?
What's the best way to play it? Yeah.
And the Iranians have been doing this since since Lebanon, Beirut. I remember '84. It's really started around that time. So I don't think one can condemn the British government for not too much, because it's not. People will say, why don't you put on more pressure? Well, what exactly do you do?
There's only so much they can do.
But I do think it underlines, if you get involved in the Middle East or anything like this, it's a very dangerous place to be. Bombing Syria, this is a big thing to do, This is going to offend a lot of people and so forth. I don't think that those things are true. One talks about Brexit. What will Britain need after Brexit? Need a more powerful state,
Yeah.
But again, there's no sign that these things have actually been thought through.
I would just say for Nazanin, though, they didn't condemn her being held. She was held in solitary confinement for 8 months, and she was near suicidal at the end of it. It doesn't matter if, the British government took a very long time to even condemn that she was behind bars. And I think a long time to even say that she didn't work as a spy. So I think even if you're not going to go all out and, do whatever, you can at the very least, it is bewildering when you're trapped in this nightmare and you don't feel like...
You want someone to stand up
for you. Yeah, and I think, they could have at least condemning the fact that she's been, even if you're confused at why she's behind bars, holding someone in a solitary confinement for 8 months is not, is horrendous, and a trial where you don't have proper legal representation and there's a single or 2 or 3 court case, 3 court sessions and that's it, and her being withheld access to medical treatment and all these, things. I think you can at the very least say this is wrong, even if you don't go on guns blazing. I'm
sorry, there's more to say about Nazanin. Yeah. I want to quickly move on to climate change very briefly, because we need to get to questions. Climate change in the Middle East, it's a universal issue, but it's also in the Middle East sort of profoundly, it's a big issue you've both written about. To what extent do you think climate change threatens the stability in the Middle East? You've written about Iraq, I know, and desertification, mismanagement of water resources.
Yeah, it's one of the factors which, destabilizes it. It's one of them. And it's again sort of inability to sort of do anything about this, You sort of, you have this sort of desertification, vast farmers unable to, you look at the canals and you can see there just isn't enough water for the fields, That I was up north in Baghdad with one guy and he was sort of showing me, I used to have all these fields, now, there's just a few clumps of grass. The other thing that struck me, particularly in Baghdad, is just the ineffectiveness of the government to do anything about this, to what are you doing? Are you talking to the Turks? Oh, well, we might meet them sometime, But
it's all a bit too slow.
It's sort of too slow and ineffectual. And it's the sort of incapacity of the government of Baghdad to do anything about this. But sure, that it means there are a lot more unhappy people, more people pour into the cities and so forth.
Yeah.
I put more pressure on.
You've obviously written about the issue for...
I'm mildly obsessed
for your fantastic Water Wars series. You've seen you go to Jordan, Iraq, You've written about it from Palestine and Israel, and you're going to South Sudan soon.
And the Gulf, yeah.
And the Gulf. Obviously, you're seeing it as a threat to stability as well. But are there any positives we can take away, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably be a little bit stronger than Patrick. I think it is, it's not just climate change, it's also like man-made environmental issues. I mean, you could solve the water crisis in Iraq if the government got, sorted out international dams and also just stopped people from doing crazy amounts of flooding irrigation. But not to get into the specifics of things, I think we noticed from UN released one of its first comprehensive reports on climate change, and they said that we are the last generation that can fix this problem. And when you have a situation like we have the Middle East, which is already a region full of conflict, but of course it's just very hot, with lack of water supplies, and I think it's going to be, we're going to see wars over water. And I'm not just saying that because I'm in the middle of a mad series about it, but we're already seeing fighting happening over
where
water.
do you think this could happen? Where you've been reporting from?
We've already seen conflict down in the south. So I was in Basra last year, where the marshlands are drying up. The environmental ministry there told me that you could see the internal displacement of 4 million people over the next 8 years. To put that in context, 3 million were displaced by the conflict with ISIS. So imagine it's going to be an even bigger internally displaced crisis. And the problem is that the security is terrible at the moment. Like, where are people going to go? Jordan is one of the most driest countries in the world. We could see a peace deal between Jordan and Israel collapse over this because of these out-of-date water agreements. I've just published a story about Gaza. I mean, as I mentioned, Gaza has one natural source of water, the coastal aquifer. That will collapse next year. Collapse, which means there will be no access to a natural source
because
of water.
Because they're having to overuse
They're
it.
overusing, they're overpumping it by 4 times.
Because they have to.
They have to, yeah. And without electricity, to be able to make desalination plants, without being able to recycle the water, we're talking about 2.2 million people without access to a natural source of water, which is, when you look at Gaza, the statistics are ridiculous anyway in terms of like unemployment rate and everything. I mean, the only reason I sat with the World Health Organization, the only reason there hasn't been like a massive outbreak of things like cholera and perhaps not cholera, but like typhoid and other instances is simply because Gaza is basically run by NGOs. It's got a 100% vaccination rate, which is kind of mad. But that's the only reason it stopped mass outbreaks of disease. But we've also got conflict over the Nile, which is why I'm going to be looking in South Sudan next week, and Yemen. I mean, there's massive water infrastructure problems in Yemen, and also issues of climate change up in northern Iraq as well. This is something that has always been relegated to the back pages of newspapers. It's always, environmental journalism is fluffy.
It's not the sexiest story.
It's not the sexiest story. And it's been really hard trying to get people interested in it. But we are the last generation that can fix this crisis.
And have you seen sort of any positive initiatives or youth groups that are doing things to combat this in the Middle East?
Well, actually, I'd have to say that Israel, believe it or not, is the most efficient in terms of water recycling. 80% of Israel's water is recycled. The next below that is Spain at 20%.
Oh, so Israel's top for the world?
Top of the world.
Oh, right.
Top of the world. Also top of the world in terms of cheap desalination and environmentally friendly technology. This is basically... and that's why I think, going back to the place where I'm based, like these water agreements between Jordan and Israel and Palestine, not to get into something that's too boring, they were written in 1995 before desalination technology was really what it is today. We can make our own water. We can fix these issues, even with climate change, even with, temperatures rising. But we actually have to see it as something that is about international security. And I mean, I've looked into things like recruitment in terms of, extremist groups. Yeah. I mean, ISIS actually used droughts in Iraq to recruit, and they can do it again, or other groups can do it again. So I think we need to think a little bit more outside the box rather than just like fights over oil or fights over borders.
Or religion,
or
tribalism,
yeah, we're looking at something much more fundamental. And I've seen footage of groups fighting over canals, and it will happen. And it can't be ignored.
Okay, well, I think we've covered our main topics. I think it's now time for any questions from the audience. If anyone has one they would like to start with. Hi, can you just wait for the mic? Just this lady here.
So we're around, sorry, my date's a little bit imprecise, but around about the century of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and indeed the Balfour Declaration. 100 years on, one sometimes wonders whether they'd all been better off under a rather degenerate and fatally inefficient Ottoman Empire. Sorry, this is meant to be controversial.
I think the Ottoman Empire has been getting, slightly more good publicity than it deserves. Partly because things were so bad afterwards, but they were pretty bad before, The massacres of the Armenians, which, weren't just in 1915, but had started before. This was not quite as sort of as good as people now pretend, the millet system of dividing up the different, treating each sect differently. Yeah, in some ways that worked, but it also increased sort of religious hatred and so forth. So, it was bad before and it's bad now. But I don't think the idea of going back to the Ottomans or even the sort of thing the Ottomans did really holds water.
Do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't think so.
Any other questions? I've got some from social that I can refer to as well. But thank you.
Just a quick question.
Is it directed at either of them in particular? Or?
Yeah, either.
Okay.
Do you think that the Americans are ready to tolerate a controlled ISIS to serve their purposes, or this is not true at all?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear.
Will the US accept a sort of controlled ISIS?
Well, how do you control ISIS? No, I don't think that they would.
Especially the way that ISIS is going, which is probably lone wolf attacks across the world.
I don't see how you could have a deal with them. So I don't think there's anything to accept.
There's no way they're going to become and put down their weapons anytime soon.
Run up the white flag? No, I don't think so. They're not that type of group.
No.
And we were discussing earlier, have they been defeated? Well, yes, they've lost most of what they had at one point, but they're not wholly out of business. And such was the sort of the appalling reputation they had previously. They don't have to do much to ignite fear anywhere, whether it's in Baghdad or in central London, a few hundred yards from where we're sitting. In Baghdad last year, much less violence than previously, but then ISIS, Daesh, stopped some people on the road between Baghdad and Kirkuk, and half a dozen people got killed. And, friends of mine were saying, it's all back, and, it's what it was. ISIS is back. Things are going to be as bad. They're going to be worse, in fact, I can understand, given what had happened previously, why they had this paranoia. But it wasn't justified by events. But it does show that ISIS doesn't have to do very much to
ignite that fear.
To ignite these fears once again.
And I also don't think they want to be controlled either. I mean, I think their whole modus operandi is to have overly blown attacks on,
and to sow chaos.
And to sow chaos. The way that they have got their name is by being extremely violent and brutal, and that's targeting, the West, including the US. So that's part of their sort of defining existence.
Gentleman here.
Is there a country or a person in the Middle East that is a force for good or for stability?
You can both answer that.
I mean, as individuals, one of the most incredible things about covering the Middle East is meeting people and what they go through. As you were asking me that question, I know you're probably thinking about in terms of a leader who can take on the mess. But instantly, I was thinking about this incredible Yemeni doctor called Ashwaq Muharrem, who's a gynecologist, and he's just been fighting a single-handed battle against famine in Hodeidah since before Yemen was a war everyone cared about. And I was just literally talking to her the other day, and I have no idea why she does what she does. And she's an incredible force for good and has saved so many lives in Hodeidah. But in terms of like that figure, I mean, there's been so many that people have put faith in Egypt, you know, like al-Baradei, you know, people thought he might be the leader of Egypt, and he genuinely was afraid of crowds and just wanted to leave Egypt. But I mean, I can't think of you know, apart from individuals like that Yemeni doctor, I can't think of a figure.
There's no outstanding leader that speaks to you of a positive
Well, yeah,
use.
Hold on a minute. I mean, often people in Iraq say, well, what you need is Saddam back, actually. And
This is across the region, yeah.
Yeah.
We need Gaddafi back,
but,
we need
yeah,
Mubarak
but
back.
you see, I knew Iraq. I first went to Iraq in 1977. I knew it under Saddam. You know, it's an awful lot better now. You know, yeah, it's very corrupt, but you know, but they do have an elected parliament. You know, these are real elections take place. You know, there is a sort of judicial system. This is an awful lot better than Saddam. You know, so it's very. And it's rather sort of lethal, or potentially lethal, this belief that somehow if there was a great leader could turn up, that everything would get a lot better. When all the experience is, it gets a great deal worse. But, you know, that is an example. Iraq is better than it was.
Yeah.
Not great, you know, an awful lot of people dead. But there is an improvement. But the last thing one needs is more strongmen in the Middle East, you know, which look at their record in the past, you know, look at their record at present.
Yeah. Gentleman in the front here, second row.
Do you think there's a role for some of those countries like Saudi that want to reform in terms of tourism? So, for example, Egypt collapsed, you know, after the plane that crashed in Sinai because the British government said, frankly, they haven't stood up and said, you know, we're not going to allow planes to fly to Sharm el-Sheikh. Is there a role for Western democracies, as you know, not in places like Syria, but those countries which are trying to improve security? That, you know, obviously Tunisia obviously went through the same problems of kind of helping countries support their economic development by working with them to make it safe for us to go on holiday and have our 2 weeks in the sun there once a year.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that if you don't mind. I mean, I think it's an interesting point. But the problem is,
So basically,
what makes
the question
security?
Is, can tourism be used to
yeah, I mean, but
democratise?
what makes security is the question. We take an example like Egypt. So people have seen President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as a bulwark against whatever nightmare is in North Africa, Libya, basically, and all the kind of jihadi groups, and have supported him because he's a military man and he can bring stability, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously tourism is really important to the economy in Egypt in terms of, like, you know, literally putting food on the table. But the issue is, you know, if you support, therefore, the regimes that are in place, you know, you could argue that the reason that there has been an uptick in terror attacks since the 2013 overthrow of Mohamed Morsi is because of the crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood and on anyone who was against the regime. And you can't really have stability if you crush everyone to the point where you have extremist groups. So, you know, if you want to... and I definitely think... So I'm divided, is what I'm trying to say, is that, yes, tourism is really important because people need to put food on the table. You know, that will bring the country together. But at the same time, if you're going to support a regime like Sisi that is, you know, randomly locking people up all over the place or deporting them, or, you know, I mean, who knows what's happening in North Sinai? Because journalists have not had access to North Sinai since 2013, like foreign correspondents. So we have no idea what's going on. Then I think that causes problems. And the same thing with Saudi. I mean, Saudi does need to reduce its dependency on oil because it's...
And it has started giving out tourist visas.
Right, it started giving out tourist visas, and that's why they keep building all these so-called tourist resorts, or they're trying to anyway.
But you don't think tourism can come before democracy? You can't lead to it?
I mean, it can do, but I don't think it's going to make us a more stable region. I mean, because the underlying problems are still there. You might have some people who work in the tourism industry that have money, but in the end, if you're locking up every dissenter, or if you're, in the case of, you know, Mohammed bin Salman, locking up literally hundreds of people in the Ritz-Carlton incident, which we didn't really talk about, but, you know, and upsetting whole strands of your family. I mean, I think the survival of MBS has probably got to do more with whether the House of Saud want to get rid of him or not, because they also don't want to have an uprising because they're very happy the fact that the Saud family's in power. But I've gone off on a tangent there. But the point is that even if you were to support tourism in like Saudi or Egypt, all these places,
other things have to happen in tandem.
Yeah, you can't. It's not going to stop a jihadi group from flourishing. It just gives them people to target.
Gentleman in the second row, check shirt.
Having heard Richard Ratcliffe speak, his point, as I understand it, is that the Iranians originally purchased or paid for British military hardware, which for whatever reason was never delivered. Is it unreasonable for the Iranians to expect to get that money back? And since it's now nearly 50 years since they paid that money over, shouldn't they also expect some interest on that money? And how does the British government just ignore that? And what is the British government's position on that?
That's a good question.
What do they say? They don't seem to answer it at all.
The case is still ongoing. They have lawyers who kind of meet regularly and talk about this issue. The reason they never paid the bill is because the Shah was overthrown. And I think
they didn't supply the hardware.
Yes,
they did get the money.
They did get the money. Sorry, they did get the money, but they didn't supply the hardware. In fact, I think they might have given it sold it on to Iraq actually, and then that really.
So they've already been paid for that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit naughty. I think. This is. I'm not an expert on this, but I think the Ministry of Defence was a bit like, well, you don't need to worry about that so much. But there definitely there's meetings about it. There is someone who's assigned. I mean, I don't know, Patrick, if you know much about this? Know more about. There are people who are assigned to manage this case, but I think they just
not in detail, no. But it's sort of a way of putting pressure on foreign countries that this is one thing, that they can negotiate about that. I mean, this is what led to the Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s. Is the sorry. I mean, but I think there are two separate things. One, the rights and wrongs of this money owed or money held for these arms. And secondly, that the Iranians and various other regimes see this as a pressure point. So it's not this particular question. It could be some other question. And it's always been part of their sort of. So if you say, if we given them what they'd want, this wouldn't have happened, well, that isn't necessarily so.
I think it's also important to realise, and I'm no Iran expert, so just to say that first, but it's important to realise that Iran isn't like a battle between different wings of the government, including the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. But I don't think that the Iranian Foreign Minister has much control over. It was actually taken down south to an entirely different part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. There was an internal fight between. So I think the problem is that, and there's been lots of different messages communicated to Richard about why she's behind bars. The tank issue. So it's not as clear cut as it's not. Split, and Nazanin's sort of caught in this nightmare middle, and her daughter Gabriella, who can't speak English anymore, and that's Richard can't speak to his daughter anymore because she was so little. But I think the issue is that it's split itself, and I think there's many reasons why she's being taken, and it may not be even just the payment of this bill.
I'm going to ask one question that we received on Twitter from or will it at some point boil over? I mean, obviously we saw uprisings across the Middle East, but Jordan, there were some small ones in the very early days in 2011, but they have a lot of similar problems. Do you see an uprising happening there at any point?
First of all, you can't rule that. Well, to the Jordanians' credit, they didn't actually shoot back in a lot of these places. Set up their own Tahrir Square, like in Cairo, we must immediately jump on them and crush them.
I remember there were images of Queen Rania just handing out bottles of water to protesters.
Yeah. They didn't do that. And the regime in general in Jordan has never been as bloodthirsty as in Syria or Iraq or Israel, for that matter.
I think the monarchy is loved as well, actually, genuinely. I think the monarchy in Jordan is actually, I mean, every single establishment you go into has a picture of the king and his son. That doesn't necessarily mean anything, I know.
Hold it right there.
But I think there is something to be said about the fact that the monarchies, can you say this? Maybe that's a bit too much. But like Morocco, for example.
There's more affection for the monarchy in Jordan.
And I think there have been some issues, and I think the king responded to those demands by making changes. But I don't think.
Yeah, I'm not sure the picture on the wall tells one a great deal.
No, I mean, I was slightly being facetious there.
But it is true, the exaggerated use, Saddam was always a thug, but he was always going to use violence, but the incredible excessive violence was completely unnecessary. And that's what eventually sort of, destroyed him.
Yeah, but you don't see that happening in Jordan.
No, it could happen, but it's not quite the same tradition as its neighbours.
If the water crisis continues, I'm going to stop talking about water.
I think we've got time for one or two more questions, if anyone has. Okay, right at the back, this lady.
With the humanitarian crisis that's going on, and am I right in thinking that bacteria are becoming more resistant to antibiotics? And obviously that can cross borders ever so easily. Should we use that as maybe a tool to try and do something about the humanitarian crisis so that it doesn't involve all of us?
Are you talking about Yemen?
I'm talking about any place, Gaza or Yemen, anywhere where there's lack of antibiotics to treat bacteria and therefore they become more resistant, and that could affect the whole world.
I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I would say that these humanitarian crises, they do overspill borders. And I think that's the whole point in terms of why people are raising the alarm about Gaza. You can't just lock people into a small area. For example, if we're going to talk about pollution, I think it's 3/4 of Gaza's beaches are polluted, and that water is infecting Israel. So they've had to shut down plants in the south in Ashkelon, they've had to shut down beaches. We have had instances which haven't been 100% proved because there's not the laboratories in Gaza to do this, but of people dying from swimming in the sea and even just walking on the sand. 97% of Gaza's water is undrinkable. This, you can't corral that into one space. And I think, Yemen is a slightly unique situation because geographically it can sort of be separated, but definitely these things cross borders. And that's, I think, the argument why you can't just ignore a humanitarian crisis. I think there was
one more. I think our last question, right at the back.
So I think you raised an interesting point earlier, that one of the lessons from the Yemeni conflict that doesn't get talked about enough is how powerful the UAE is now in terms of military projection, in terms of expeditionary force. For such a small country. I'd be interested to get both of your opinions on how big a priority is it for the UAE to have such strong military capabilities, and what's their motive? Is it just to counter Iran, or do you see something else behind it?
Do you want to start with that, Patrick?
Well, they can do it, they have the money to do it, but keep in mind they haven't won any more than the Saudis have. I mean, that's the crucial fact, to my mind, of the war in Yemen, apart from the fact that all these people are on the verge of starvation.
But setting up the bases there, why are they doing that?
Well, they want to extend their authority in that area. They can do so. There's something of a vacuum. Yemen has a reputation, a bit like Lebanon, as easier to get into than get out of, And the first day of the war is always the best, And that, so there's that threat, and they may not take that on board to the degree they ought. Will the same thing happen to them as Saudi Arabia? Because Saudi Arabia has so much money that as soon as Mohammed bin Salman came in, they had a very aggressive interventionist foreign policy. It hasn't worked. You can't turn money into political and military power just like that. Yeah. Will the same thing happen to the UAE? I don't know. But but what we've seen all over the Middle East is not suggests that that won't happen. Saddam in Iraq and so forth thought he could make Iraq a great military power because he had money. He couldn't, you know, it was disaster.
So the UAE is being a bit overly ambitious about what it can achieve.
I think that the sort of thing that you get into in Yemen, what is victory in Yemen? Who do you defeat? If you do defeat somebody, there's always somebody else.
Yeah.
So I think it's more dangerous, and their position is perhaps less secure in the long term than they might imagine.
And to what extent do you think they are motivated by a desire to rival Iran?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of give the official UAE perspective, I mean, when I sat with all the commanders, including the leading guy who's actually Australian, you know, they said they didn't want to be in Yemen forever. And I mean, I don't know if they do. They certainly have quite an impressive array of bases all along the south. I would say, I think for the Saudis, Iran is a big issue because they have a Shia population. And
less so for the Emirates, maybe?
Yeah, less so for the Emirates. So the Saudis have a problem in the east in terms of the Shia population, which never gets covered because no one can get there. But you know, there were stages where there was actually quite a lot of conflict there, and they sort of see the kind of the Houthis on their border as sort of inciting that, and as part of the Iranian, I guess, sort of fingers in the region. I think for the UAE, it's probably more strategic for them, you know, and I think certainly looking at so the war that they really are fighting in Yemen isn't to do with the Houthis. They're actually pitching it as a counter-terror war, and they've got the Americans on the side, and they've actually built up, I said, they trained 60,000 Yemeni forces of various different kinds, tribes, including, as it turns out, former Al-Qaeda fighters. They actually admitted that to me. Again, this is part of the problem of once you get into Yemen, it's a mess, and you can't tell who's who. So I think they probably, even though they've told me so officially they want to get out of Yemen, I think they've probably bitten off maybe more than they can chew. But I think, you know, for them, it's probably very strategic. You know, I think it's quite, you know, they control Makala now. They control Aden. The head of security at the Aden airport, which is basically the main airport now because Sana'a is closed, is placed there by the Emiratis, trained by the Emiratis, and by the way, is a southern separatist as well. And as I said, they've got their bases on the other side in Assad in Eritrea, and likely they want to put their boots on the ground in Harida. So I think for them, I think it's less about Iran and more about their own interest in having some kind of influence somewhere. And this is an extremely strategic part of the world where, and I mean, they are hosting southern separatists within their own country. So there's got to be something in there, I think.
Well, thank you for those great questions. I think Christian has one final word for us.
Actually, it's one final question that I just wanted to pitch. Just 30 seconds each, please. I know we're really out of time, but I just want to ask one thing myself. From your personal experiences in the region, looking around, is there anything? I mean, it's bleak. Clearly, it's a bleak region. It's got, you know, the event is called a region on the brink. Is there anything that gives us a glimmer? Is there a region that's slightly improving? Is there a progress of something that you've witnessed yourselves that gave you pause for thought and to feel hopeful?
Can I go first?
Yes, of course. Yes. Haven't said it. Well, you haven't said it enough, have you? So yeah.
Something that I watched in Lebanon was they already have quite a strong progressive strand of society, and it's amazing to see that grow. And they have things like, you know, openly like gay club nights and drag queens and things like that. So, and they're moving towards like campaigning for civil marriage. So there are definitely very inspirational things happening there. That's my bit.
Very good answer. Next, who wants to go? Patrick?
Yeah, the war in Iraq, which has been going on, hot or cold war, since about 1980, is ending. That the war, you know, it's really, there isn't much violence in Iraq now, better than any time for 40 years. Syria, it might be ending. Now, this is very important because this is the crucible of war in the Middle East. This is where ISIS came from. This has affected other areas. And you can't, when war's going on, you can't do anything. You can't have any reforms. Nothing ever gets any better because everybody's preoccupied by staying alive.
And potentially could any stability infect the region?
If the wars end in that central area, in Iraq and Syria, then the whole of the region benefits as well. So this is quite a positive element which tends to be underestimated.
Great. Belle?
Maybe I've mentioned two things. I mean, this is a slightly odd response, but I think when when Jamal disappeared, Jamal Khashoggi, who I knew for several years, as someone who I used to talk to a lot and actually be frustrated with because he never used to criticize the regime very much. When he disappeared, I just thought he was another person who was just going to vanish off the face of the earth. And we're talking, I guess, from a personal perspective, because although I'm a reporter, I'm also a human. And it was extremely upsetting when he did vanish. And what I thought was kind of really, and maybe I'm being too optimistic, but there was a response, and people didn't let up. Now, that is largely orchestrated, you could say, because the Turks kept releasing these gory details, and they were playing all their parts and everything. But it had an impact, and I think it will, and it has arguably been one of the biggest events.
His death won't be in vain.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we didn't always see eye to eye on everything, but, you know, he was an extremely kind and gentle human being, and his death is just horrendous, but it had an impact. And that is actually, that means a lot, because the number of times you try and drum up interest in the world and no one cares. And it just, this cycle of violence. There might be one photo of a Syrian little boy on a beach dead, or a Syrian in an Aleppo airstrike, and people care for 5 seconds and then don't care anymore. But this kept going, and I think is still going, and I think that has actually altered sort of opinions about different countries in the world, and that's important. And the second one I would just briefly say is much more small. I mean, apart from this Yemeni doctor who I think is wonderful, I came across some civilians who live on the border of Gaza in Israel, and some civilians in Gaza, and they talk on Skype and they talk on WhatsApp and they share videos when there's rocket fire and airstrikes, and they're trying to set up an app so that Israelis can talk to Palestinians in Gaza, because they used to work side by side, and they don't know each other, and that's a very dangerous situation, and very specific to Gaza actually, because if you don't know who your so-called enemy is, and you just hear all the propaganda, then it becomes really dangerous. And what's amazing about these people is they live maybe a kilometre away from each other. They've never met. They can't meet. They're divided by a border or fence, whatever you want to call it, and they're under fire from each other's armed groups, and they're disillusioned with each other's governments. And and during all the last escalation of the last year, when we nearly had a war, they were sharing videos and looking after each other and setting up this app. And that, these are civilians, you know, civilians to civilians, and sometimes I think that's the only way. So yeah, those are the two things that bring me hope and sadness.
Well, thank you, Patrick, Olivia and Belle, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for subscribing. It really is something that makes a huge difference to us. It empowers our journalism. It means that these people can carry on doing what they do. It really does make a difference. So thank you very much. We will now go downstairs. There are more drinks. Some of us will be there. So please do continue the conversation. And if you did have a question that you didn't get a chance to ask, we are responding. If you subscribe to Independent Minds and you go on the homepage, there's a box there where you can ask us questions. We do write articles in return to them. I don't know if that's actually happened to anyone here yet, but I promise you that we definitely do. Or email editor@independent.co.uk. Thank you very, very much.